Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us here tonight for our event with Mary Ziegler and her new book, Abortion and the Law in America, Roe v. Wade to the Present. This event is co-presented by Mother Jones. We're happy to have their reproductive rights reporter, Becca Andrews, who will here tonight, who will be in conversation with Mary about the book. My name is Evan Karp, and I'm the events manager for Booksmith. We're an independent bookstore and a mainstay of San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district since 1976. Joining Mary in conversation is Becca Andrews. She's a reporter at Mother Jones. A Southerner, she most often writes about the Southeast, gender, and culture. Before joining Mother Jones as an editorial fellow, she wrote for newspapers in Tennessee. Her work has also appeared in Slate, Marie Claire UK, and USA Today. Her first book, No Choice, on the dwindling access to abortion in the United States, is forthcoming from Hachette's Public Affairs imprint. And Mary Ziegler is the Stearns Weaver Miller Professor at Florida State University College of Law. Pulitzer Prize-winning historian David Garrow has called her the premier historian of abortion in the post-Roe era. She teaches and writes on the legal history of reproduction and constitutional law, family law, and sexuality. Her latest book is Abortion and the Law in America, Roe v. Wade to the Present. That's just out from Cambridge University Press. And her first book, After Roe, The Lost History of the Abortion Debate, out in 2015 from Harvard, was the winner of the 2014 Harvard University Press Thomas J. Wilson Memorial Prize for Best First Manuscript in any discipline. She often serves as commentator in leading mass media outlets across the world, including The Atlantic, the BBC, the Boston Globe, CNN, The Guardian, MSNBC, NBC, the New York Times, NPR, PBS NewsHour, Politico, The Wall Street Journal, and The Washington Post. Without further ado, I'm very happy to turn it over to Mary and Becca. Mary, congratulations on the book, and thank you both for being here.
Thanks, Evan.
Thank you. Mary, how are you doing?
I'm good. Yeah, well, Becca and I were just saying we talk a lot about these issues, just the two of us. So it's fun to be sharing this conversation with all the rest of you. And we're bringing it from the Southeast to the rest of the world. We're all in the Southeast.
Our specialty. Because things never ever stop in 2021, just like 2020. We had a Supreme Court ruling the other day. Mm-hmm. Can you tell me a little bit about that ruling on the requirements for medication abortion during the pandemic and what that sort of says about the current makeup of the court?
Sure. So this was our first look at what the court with Amy Coney Barrett on it was going to do on abortion. So this litigation has been hanging for a long time. For a long time, there's been a requirement that women taking part of the 2-drug protocol for medication abortion get that medication mifepristone in person from a doctor. So there are regulations about who can prescribe mifepristone. And even though women or pregnant people can take the medication at home on their own, they have to actually go in person to a doctor to get it. So the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists had sued, saying essentially that this was a terrible idea during the COVID-19 pandemic because it was going to require patients more face-to-face contact with people in a medical setting, which would mean more COVID, and that was, the constitutional buzzword would be an undue burden, essentially, that it was a substantial obstacle to people seeking to exercise their abortion rights. And the Trump administration fought back, and there had been an order in the lower courts blocking the FDA's in-person requirement. And the Supreme Court had kind of punted on this, told the lower court to get more evidence. It came back to the Supreme Court. And what was really surprising was after kind of kicking the can down the road for months on this, the Supreme Court, with weeks to go in the Trump administration, granted the administration's request and reinstated the requirement. So it's unclear how much of a concrete impact this is going to have, because we expect, of course, that the FDA will change when President-elect Biden is in office. And we assume that, along with that, the in-person requirement will change too. But it's still it almost feels like the Supreme Court reaching out to send a message. It's really hard for me to see why else, after waiting this long, the court would bother to do this. And of course, that sends a signal about what the court is going to do about other pending abortion cases, because of course this isn't by a long stretch the only case before the court, even in this week, right? The court tomorrow is meeting for the second time after rescheduling 8 times a major abortion case out of Mississippi.
Yeah, can you tell us a little bit about that case?
Yeah, the law in the case, it's called Dobbs, is a pretty straightforward law. So everybody listening to this has probably seen that states have been experimenting with different lines in terms of when to ban abortion. So, if you go back far enough, it was 20 weeks. And then there were these heartbeat bans in 2019 that were at 6 weeks. Mississippi's line is 15 weeks. And Mississippi at least tries to justify this by saying that fetal pain is possible at 15 weeks. And it's worth saying that most experts don't think that. In fact, the 20-week ban was originally predicated on the idea of fetal pain too. And most experts didn't think it was possible then. And so Mississippi was like, let's go for 15, why not? But it would be significant because, of course, the Supreme Court has never allowed for an outright ban for viability, which is well after 15 weeks. So either if the court took Dobbs and upheld this law, it would either result in the court directly overturning Roe and in the decision that came after it, Planned Parenthood versus Casey, or if not, then rewriting Roe to such an extent that the eventual overturning would either be an inevitability or almost an afterthought.
Yeah, it seems like in that case, either way, if they rule somehow in favor of the state, is a big step toward dismantling Roe and dismantling abortion rights in this country.
Right. I mean, and it's interesting now. What the court's going to do is harder to say. I mean, I think the Democrats winning the Senate changes the calculus for the court, because I think I had assumed that the Democrats were not going to win the Senate because the Georgia runoff process is designed, to make that not happen, basically. And I assumed that the court would feel kind of like, letting its freak flag fly for 2 years, basically, because it would look like any of the things on the table people talked about, expanding the court or creating term limits or other sorts of court reform options. It looked like those were going to be a non-issue. But now, of course, the court knows that if it did do something dramatic in Dobbs, the odds of things like that, I think, would increase exponentially, even if the Biden administration, doesn't instinctually want to do something like that right out of the gate. I think if the court forced his hand, it would be a lot more likely.
Mm. I've been thinking a lot, particularly over the past 4 years, but certainly like with the advent of social media, about misinformation campaigns. And I wondered if you would talk a little bit about the effects of misinformation campaigns on abortion policy over the past, decade or so.
Yeah, I mean, that was actually the thing that struck me the most when I was writing my book. So my first book about the abortion debate was sort of a hopeful experience when I was writing it. It was the first time I did oral histories where I talked to people who were opposed to abortion and people who were in favor of access to abortion. I found lots of people who seemed to sort of get that if you don't give people access to abortion, you need to give them better maternity care or better protections against pregnancy discrimination. It made it seem as if you could have not a rational abortion debate exactly, but certainly one where there was more concern on both sides of the aisle about pregnant people. And writing this book was really depressing because what increasingly became clear was that people just don't inhabit the same factual universe. So it's been really resonant since the election because a lot of the people I've studied are saying the same things. Essentially, they would encounter data about, for example, the safety of abortion or its mental health effects, or the connection between abortion and breast cancer that didn't jive with their deeply held beliefs that abortion was wrong. And instead of accepting that data, they would say essentially the data comes from people who are biased or who are liberal or who are pro-choice. And so therefore we can't trust it. And we have to come up with our own data and our own experts and our own media sources. And essentially you can't trust the medical establishment. You can't trust public health authorities. You can't trust the media. A lot of the things we're seeing play out now with everything from distrust of mask mandates to the really distrust of the election results. And it was disturbing and sad to see that happen, especially when it was some of these same people who had seemed to sort of get it, that if you, not about abortion, but about sort of aligned issues like pregnancy discrimination, see those same people kind of go down this rabbit hole of no longer trusting any kind of conventional authority and looking for facts that jived with their beliefs, whether or not those facts really had much support.
Do you feel like that's an escalation of what we've seen in the past with like conservative think tanks and anti-abortion think tanks who sort of do their own separate research and release it, even if like the science is sort of spurious?
Yeah, I mean, there've always been arguments like that, right? So like if you go to the very like, the 50s or the 60s or even earlier, there were always arguments, for example, that abortion made you sick, right? I mean, so the idea, or that one of the sort of famous ones is that you can't get pregnant from rape, which was an argument that's been around, I think, at least since the 60s when there were first efforts to reform abortion. I mean, actually, at least since the 19th century, but kind of got recycled in the 1960s. So it's not that the arguments are new, it's more that people seem to care more about the arguments, if you will. I think that if you're looking at the 60s, the 70s, even the early 80s, anti-abortion folks, I think, really deeply believe in what they think is true about when life begins and what rights the Constitution protects when it comes to fetal life. And they thought that if they just sort of said what they thought about fetal life, that everybody would come on board. And when it became increasingly obvious that that wasn't true, either with respect to the Supreme Court or to the rest of us, there was this sort of tactical shift more toward arguments about how abortion affects pregnant people and families and so on. And I think it was at that point that this sort of these kind of questionable or spurious factual claims took on more significance, and a lot more money and thought was invested in them. So they were always there, but they were sort of playing second fiddle in a way to some of the more kind of classic, there's a right to life in the Declaration of Independence types of claims that are more familiar to us. And now, really, I mean, if you're thinking either about how is the attack on Roe v. Wade being mounted in the courts, or even, some of the things you see in politics, right? I mean, Ted Cruz has recently tried to get abortion pills taken off the market and be labeled dangerous. Even the sort of political rhetoric of abortion is often about, what abortion in America is really like. It's not always even about fetal rights anymore. And so I think the more central that rhetoric became, the more important it became for abortion opponents to, find their own data or do their own research, regardless of what everybody else had already concluded.
Looking forward, I feel like there's been a lot of excitement among abortion advocacy groups about the next 4 years under a Biden administration. And of course, like that excitement is ratcheted up now that Democrats have controlled the Senate as well. And I've seen abortion advocacy groups releasing these wish lists for the Biden administration. And I wonder what you think are some potential policy wins for abortion rights that could be accomplished.
I mean, there's some kind of obvious ones, right, that you don't even need the Senate for. And even if you have Congress, right, that like Congress didn't get to be unpopular and famous for being slow because it's incredibly efficient and effective, right? So even with a Democratic Congress, that's going to take a while. So the obvious sorts of wins, Biden will probably try to undo some of the Trump administration regulations that intersect with abortion. So things like the gag rule, you guys may remember that abortion clinics can't, or not abortion clinics, anyone receiving family planning funding can't make referrals for abortion or otherwise mention abortion. Those regulations will probably go. Some of the Trump administration sort of like really broad definitions of conscience for health providers and even anyone sort of remotely working with health providers, like people scheduling appointments or janitors cleaning clinics. Those will probably narrow again and look more the way they did in the Obama administration, where there were still conscience protections, but for like a narrower group of folks, usually people more directly involved in things like abortion or LGBTQ services. There'll probably be, again, I would assume maybe the elimination of the in-person requirement for medication abortion, and that would be huge during the pandemic. And it would be huge too if the Supreme Court does overturn Roe, right? Because access to medication abortion is really going to be one of the major determinants of whether people can have abortions in places like Alabama and a post-Roe America. Sort of another huge one, of course, is judges, right? I mean, Trump has nominated a historical number of judges, not just to the US Supreme Court, but to the federal courts as well. And so I would expect to see Biden kind of replacing some of the older federal circuit judges and district judges. Probably we'll see a replacement of Stephen Breyer on the US Supreme Court so that there won't be a kind of continuing or escalating attack on abortion rights in the federal courts. And there may be some pressure to do something like court reform too, because of course, if the Biden administration is successful, for example, in passing a law codifying Roe, which is what Biden claims he wants to do, then a conservative Supreme Court could say it was unconstitutional, right? And I would actually sort of expect that to happen. So that might happen too. And then, of course, there's legislative steps that are everybody's looking at. The Democratic caucus has been pretty much in lockstep about repealing the Hyde Amendment, which most of you know is a ban on Medicaid reimbursement for abortion. That's a possibility for the first time really in decades. And there have been sort of broader pro-choice bills or reproductive justice bills that have been bandied about in Congress. One of the most, I guess, prominent is the Women's Health Protection Act, which sort of directly rules out specific common kinds of abortion restriction that have been popular in the states in recent years. So that's a possibility too. I mean, I think there are more hurdles when you're thinking about legislation, just because historically, even when the Democrats have controlled everything, they've kind of not been particularly united or good at pushing through legislation on abortion rights. So we've had a lot of negative historical examples there that that we'd have to sort of see, the Democratic caucus improve on this time around.
Mm. And of course, we can't forget that these battles also really play out in state legislatures, and
right, yeah,
sort of the ones that like bear the brunt.
And state legislatures, of course, in 2020 did not get bluer, right? So, and in some places, like my home state of Montana, we have now a conservative governor there. So Montana is likely to start pumping out lots of abortion restrictions when it really wouldn't have before. And I think we'll probably see more abortion restrictions coming out of purple states too, now that there's an expectation that the Supreme Court will actually listen to pretty extreme abortion legislation. I think you'll see more states think that it's worth, rolling the dice to see what the justices will do.
I also wanted to make some space to talk a little bit about, in your book, you're really intentional about documenting how the spirit of racial justice has shown up historically, particularly in the reproductive justice movement. Would you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think, a pretty major change in how racial justice is sort of figured in the abortion debate. I think that one of the most sort of striking things to me at the present moment is that historically, both the reproductive rights, and I'm using that deliberately here, not reproductive justice, the reproductive rights movement and the anti-abortion movement were both pretty much really predominantly or virtually exclusively white. And that isn't an accident even on the reproductive rights side, because time and time again, there was a divide between the reproductive justice work being done often by feminists of color and the organizing being done by larger reproductive rights groups like your Planned Parenthood or NARAL, in part because those groups saw issues that were of more concern to women of color as being kind of losers, right? They didn't poll well, they didn't really energize donors. And the argument always was that the reproductive rights movement wanted to create a pro-choice majority, right? So to find issues that had the broadest appeal, that appealed to, for example, independents and men and so on. And so there was a kind of consistent willingness to, deprioritize things like the Hyde Amendment or a broader reproductive justice framework. And I think in the past, I would say 4 years, that's really begun to shift. And so you see the larger pro-choice organizations working hand in hand with reproductive justice organizations like Sister Song, not just sort of having women of color work in the big organizations, but actually having the reproductive justice organizations play a central part in setting strategy. And that being true, you see it reflected in politics, right? So, the Hyde Amendment being something that most Democrats oppose, as opposed to being the sort of classic bipartisan concession on abortion. I think that's a reflection of reproductive justice organizing. And even in litigation, right, one of the big challenges to heartbeat bans out of Georgia is Sister Song is the named plaintiff in that case. So I think that there's been a sort of moment of reckoning for the reproductive justice movement that talking about it's not enough to just talk about racial justice, right? And I think it's reflected both in the fact that people of color have a disproportionate number of abortions, which is both makes the issue more important to them, and is also a signal that there's been a failing of women and people of color who, are not just having more abortions because, they like them. It's because they're probably lacking access to other services, or whether that's, a living wage, whether that's family planning services, whether that's sex education, whether that's safe housing. And so I think, and there's also been, I think, interestingly and relatedly, a kind of a shift in how many people of color support access to abortion. So if you look historically, Black people tended to be more opposed to abortion than white people did. And that tended to correlate with religiosity. So in other words, like how often do you go to church? How often do you pray? And so on. And now that isn't true anymore. It's actually true that, that Black people in general are incrementally more supportive most of the time in polling of abortion rights than white people are. And I think part of that is because what it means to support abortion has been redefined by the reproductive justice movement.
Mm-hmm. You know, I'm curious in research for my own book, which, you know, is very much sort of like the oral history type of thing. I found that a lot of the history of abortion organizing has been really whitewashed. And I wonder if that's something that you encounter, if that's something that you've encountered in the research for your own book. Sorry, I'm tongue-tied.
No, that's okay. Yeah, I mean, I have. And I mean, I think I've also seen there's this sort of weird, it's almost like a cycle, right? Where you'll see reproductive rights organizers saying like, oh, gee, you know, it's not good that everybody in our organization is white. And like, we don't seem to care about issues that affect Black people. And like, that's kind of, you know, yucky and gross because we're progressives. We really ought to do something about this. And then some time will go by and they'll be like, uh-oh, we're going to lose Roe v. Wade. And that's really our priority. And we're trying to raise money by talking about the Hyde Amendment and nobody cares about the Hyde Amendment. And we're trying to get people to, you know, organize about the Hyde Amendment, and most of the, you know, kind of educated middle and upper class people that we reach don't care about the Hyde Amendment. So we'll just, you know, table that for now and table the kind of activists of color that we're working with, or kind of give them a microphone when we want, and we'll just focus on saving Roe. And that happens over and over again, right? I mean, it happens in the 70s, it happens in the 80s, it happens in the 90s. And, you know, I'm not entirely convinced it's not going to happen again. I mean, it probably won't happen again. I think it feels like a different moment, but it's hard not to be cynical about that when we're, you know, 4 decades, 5 decades into that happening. The other thing that's changed, of course, is that, and you've written about this in Mother Jones, is that, of course, the racial politics of abortion are now kind of more front and center because abortion opponents have introduced restrictions that, among other things, ban abortion on what are considered to be sort of like racist or eugenic grounds. So sort of race-based abortion, sex-based abortion, Down syndrome-based abortion. And I think that's, in a weird way, kind of forced a more of a conversation on the reproductive rights, reproductive justice side about race. You know, so for example, the kind of flagship Planned Parenthood in New York removed Margaret Sanger's name from the building. I think that had been, you know, kind of a weakness, right, for reproductive rights organizers. Not that, I mean, I've written about Margaret Sanger's eugenics involvement before, and it wasn't like she was the only person. I mean, pretty much depressingly, it's sort of like saying people in the 19-teens were racist. It was like almost all white people were racist in the 19-teens, and almost all people who were educated in the 19-teens supported eugenics. But at the same time, I think kind of, you know, treating Margaret Sanger as if she were, you know, a hero for the modern age was problematic for that reason too, just as it would be for anyone at that time who espoused those kinds of beliefs. So I think the more anti-abortion folks talk about these reasons bans and the kind of racial narrative that goes with them, the more I think it's prompted people on the reproductive rights, reproductive justice side to, you know, formulate an effective response and talk about what they mean when they think about reproductive justice and racial justice, rather than just sort of, you know, pushing the issue to the side for another day.
Absolutely. I'm also really curious about what role Senator-elect Warnock is going to play in the Senate when it comes to reproductive legislation, given that he, you know, built this platform partly around being a pro-choice pastor. It's really powerful.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting too, because I was really fascinated as a historian by the response to Warnock, because there was this huge backlash. It was almost like people were like, how can you, like, being a pro-choice pastor, it was like an oxymoron. It was impossible. Like, people couldn't believe it. And as a historian, what was striking was that it's just sort of, it's a combination of the fact that narrative makes sense if you're focusing exclusively on white people, that it makes more sense. And it also makes more sense. It was also people drinking the Kool-Aid pretty seriously when it came to what the narratives that the pro-choice or the reproductive rights movement and the anti-abortion movement have developed, right? So if you go back to the 70s, it was the roles were reversed. So the anti-abortion movement never ever talked about religion because the movement had been labeled for decades kind of a front for the Catholic Church. And the abortion rights movement talked all the time about the sort of thing that Warnock likes to talk about, right? Essentially that some faith traditions view abortion as a moral good under some circumstances. And so it was really kind of a series of historical coincidences that made people like Warnock seem so unusual or kind of pushed them out of the spotlight. And it's also a function of the fact that when people talk about religion or when they talk even about Christianity, they're often talking about white evangelicals, which is of course a small slice of, you know, believers in the United States or Christians in the United States, or even evangelical Christians in the United States, if you even want to be narrower about it, because what Warnock represents is much less uncommon within the Black community, and decreasingly uncommon in part, as I was saying, because Black Americans seem to be becoming or trending more pro-choice.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just think about the legacy of religious organizing in the abortion rights movement before Roe. You know, like you had the clergy consultation service,
right?
That was like helping women get abortion care. And
yeah, and a lot of those people are still around. Yeah, I mean, there were a lot of, I mean, and I think faith-based arguments for abortion rights were really powerful both before Roe. I mean, the major, I think, probably what looked like the most promising constitutional arguments about the Hyde Amendment were based on religion, either the separation of church and state or the freedom of people who believed that abortion was a moral good in their faith traditions to exercise that belief. And the Supreme Court kind of shut that down a little bit in 1980 in upholding the Hyde Amendment. And that was part of the reason I think you began to see the sort of major donor organizations like Planned Parenthood and NARAL move away from those arguments. But I think it's more that they've always been there, right? So the people who founded Clergy Counseling Service didn't, you know, vanish in like 1980. They've been here the whole time. It's just we're the people with on the reproductive rights or justice side with the money and the spotlight haven't been focusing on them. And so I think one of the things Warnock represents is, you know, there's more of an opportunity now to see where those people are and what they think, and that might change. And I think probably also there's been more criticism of, you know, within some of Trump's supporters of Christian nationalism and so on. So I think there's more of a sense now that no one has a monopoly on religion or on Christianity in this debate. And it'll be interesting to see what kind of reverberations that has, both, you know, both in the Supreme Court and outside of it too.
Absolutely. I'm going to invite our audience to send in questions if they have them. But while they're thinking about that, I'm gonna ask you my favorite question, which is, what did I not ask you that I should have?
Well, I guess we could talk a little bit about Roe, what might happen to Roe, or what the most likely path to overturning Roe is. And I go back and forth about this, right? So I mean, I was debating with a colleague on Twitter about, you know, is the court going to just, you know, as David French said on a panel I was with him, you know, on let's say, you know, throw down the gauntlet, right, and just go for it. And I'm still inclined to say no. Of course, we don't know. I mean, that's what makes this so devilishly hard to predict, because we can sort of predict what Justices Alito and Thomas are going to do, because they've been pretty unabashed about saying, you know, we'll overturn Roe v. Wade as soon as we get the opportunity to. And we have a sense that Chief Justice Roberts either doesn't want to overturn Roe at all, which I'm not convinced is true, or wants to go slow in overturning Roe. And he seems particularly concerned about damaging his own reputation and the reputation of the court. And then with the other three, we just have no idea, right? I mean, Barrett has never really said anything about abortion on the Supreme Court other than casting this vote on the medication abortion thing. And Kavanaugh and Gorsuch have like one opinion we've had over the summer. And even that isn't worth a whole lot, because they were aware of the fact that at the time, Chief Justice Roberts was calling the shots. So we have three conservative wildcards who may want to go the Alito-Thomas route and just get rid of Roe altogether, or they may be more attracted to the kind of Roberts, you know, death of 1,000 cuts approach. And I mean, I still maybe I'm naive about this, but I'd be a little surprised if a 15-week ban right out of the gate didn't strike them as being an invitation for the Biden administration to do some kind of court reform. So I would be more inclined to think they'd take some other kind of case that looks a little bit less controversial, but it's also hard to know what people that justices who are that conservative would think is a kind of incremental step. So maybe they'll look at it and say, most people don't have abortions after 15 weeks. So maybe this is an incremental step. It's hard to say, but I'm still, I haven't entirely changed my mind that I think a sort of slower approach to the undoing, like sort of, so the end is kind of inevitable, but not necessarily near, still seems more likely to me. And I think if that's something that sounds bad to you, that also would be more hopeful, because the longer the court takes to undo Roe, of course, the more uncertainty there becomes, right? So you could have new people added to the Supreme Court. You could have unexpected retirements or deaths on the conservative side. So then even the inevitability would sort of diminish, right? The more time the court takes in doing what I think they're ultimately intending to do.
Yeah, and you and I have talked a little bit about how, it seems like if Roberts is going to put together anti-abortion rulings, then he wants it done a certain way, right? Like he still wants it in line with the spirit of the law. He doesn't want to step out too much.
Yeah, well, and I think most there was a big, one of the decisions that I talk about in the book that was sort of a big watershed for the strategy of the more sort of sophisticated anti-abortion players was a case that upheld the Federal Partial Birth Abortion Ban Act in 2007. And that's been the sort of strategy of choice for the more cautious anti-abortion litigators, right? Because they can go and say, okay, hey, you let us ban this procedure, so what if we ban this other procedure? And it's a completely different kind of law with completely different kinds of consequences. But if you're someone like Roberts, you could say with a straight face, hey, I'm not going off the reservation here, I'm just building on the precedents we already have. Versus, for example, if it's really hard to see where you would justify a 15-week ban. I mean, that would be a pretty big departure from anything the court has done. And so if these are people who care about the fact, right, that pretty much everyone was saying that Amy Coney Barrett on the court would mean the imminent demise of Roe, if they fulfill those predictions, that could do reputational damage, I think, pretty clearly, and to them individually and to the court. So we just don't know if that's the kind of concern that would keep someone like Barrett or Kavanaugh or Gorsuch up at night, or if they're kind of more in the Alito, who gives, incendiary speeches at the Federalist Society that get recorded and doesn't feel bad about. We don't know where on the spectrum everybody lies. But I mean, I usually Supreme Court justices care about potential political backlash, and I think some backlash to the overturning of Roe is almost a given. But how and when it happens will probably have a lot to do with how serious the backlash is. And these are all pretty intelligent people, so I'm assuming they must know that.
Yeah. We're getting our first audience question, so I'm gonna read the first one, which is from Colleen Hicks. She's asking why she was told that you get fired if you tell your boss you're pregnant, and you get fired if you do not tell him you're pregnant and it becomes obvious in Arizona. How can you feed yourself and your baby if this is the way American society works? I'm not super familiar with pregnancy discrimination employment law.
Yeah, I mean, I teach employment law. It's not my area of expertise, and I definitely don't know Arizona specific rules. There's the Federal Pregnancy Discrimination Act means that you can't be fired simply for being pregnant. There are real gaps in protection. So if you're pregnant and you need accommodations to continue working, you may not be able to get them. So they're basically, if your employer, you may be able to demand accommodations if your employer is choosing to accommodate other people with disabilities. So for example, like people who are injured on the job, but not people who are pregnant, then you could bring a case that there was discrimination. But there is a gap. So if that isn't true, right, if your employer just decides not to accommodate anybody and to be, an equal opportunity employer in the sense of there's no opportunity for anyone, then you may not be able to get accommodations. But I think pregnancy discrimination has always been one of the kind of elephants in the room in the abortion debate too, of course, which is why it was a topic of interest in the 70s, because one of the things you would assume people who disagree about abortion would agree on is the idea that if people want to have the baby, that they shouldn't be forced not to do that because they will otherwise lose their jobs. And it's, I think, become increasingly hard for people on different sides of the abortion issue to work together on this, in part because the anti-abortion movement's aligned with the GOP, which tends to be anti-employment discrimination protection in the context of pregnancy, and in part just because people are so siloed when it comes to the facts that they just implicitly distrust people who disagree with them about abortion. I mean, one of the most sort of haunting moments I had about this, I was talking to someone I know who's opposed to abortion in a kind of good faith way. And I said that I assumed people would agree on maternal mortality, right? So in the United States, there's disastrously poor maternal mortality, particularly for Black people. And the person said, well, that's just a pro-choice talking point, and these people who are dying who are Black are, dying because they have bad diets or they're not working out, or, it's basically their own fault, which was totally not in character for this person when they talk about a lot of abortion topics. But as soon as it was introduced as a pro-choice talking point, it was like automatically delegitimized. And so it's become harder for people to work together on things like maternal mortality. Everybody should be opposed to maternal mortality, right? I mean, maybe,
Yeah.
I guess people are like pro attacking the US Capitol now, so maybe I just don't understand, but I would assume that people with disagreements about the abortion issue would all be like, pro save moms. That just seems like it would have to be the right answer. But I think that there's been so much of a belief that people who don't agree with you on abortion have to be either dishonest or deluded, that it makes it harder to have what seem to be the kind of obvious conversations about related issues.
Yeah, that's been my experience as well. We have another question from Phoenix Voorhees. They ask, say the conservative justices wanted to deliver the most anti-choice ruling without the potential politically disadvantageous headline that the court had completely overturned Roe. What ruling do you believe, short of overturning Roe, would be the most damaging to the pro-choice movement?
Well, I think probably the most damaging, ironically damaging to the pro-choice movement would be a decision that wasn't clearly overturning Roe, right? Because, and that, I think Chief Justice Roberts has always known that. He's a brilliant guy, and I think his approach has always been to do things that are really hard to understand. So, which would be a lot of like high-flown rhetoric about, the right to choose is still here, and then giving the states pretty much carte blanche, or at least more and more and more authority to actually restrict access to abortion. So we got a taste of how this would, the kind of road we were going down this summer in a case called June Medical versus Russo. So in the case, the court struck down this law that required abortion providers to have admitting privileges at a nearby hospital. And Roberts wrote his own separate opinion where he talked a lot about, fidelity to precedent, and we can't just overturn our own decisions willy-nilly. And then in effect, what he did was try to overturn a precedent while saying precedent was awesome. And no one knew what he had done. I went on TV that day and Jeff Toobin was like, John Roberts, he's turned over a liberal leaf and he's a changed man and all this sort of stuff. And it took people probably like the better part of a week to realize what he had even done. And that was lawyers and experts. So that's the sort of decision I think that would be the most devastating to the pro-choice movement, if you had the court doing something that in practice allowed states to restrict abortion almost to the point of banning it, but did so in a way that was so opaque that most people didn't understand. Because of course, to have a backlash, normal people need to know what happened, right? And that's not just people like me and Becca who think about this all the time. That's people like the rest of you who maybe think about this once in a while, but you have jobs and families and other issues you care about. So I think the court has been using kind of like obfuscation and kind of deliberate vagueness to manage the threat of backlash, and that might continue, or it might not, right? I mean, there's definitely the sort of Clarence Thomas wing of the court that just doesn't care about backlash and maybe even welcomes it, right? This sort of like what feels like when you're reading Fox News talking points in their opinions. So it's unclear who has the upper hand and which of those kinds of approaches we're going to see.
Well, and just to back up for a second, burn on Jeffrey Toobin. When I called you that day, you knew what was going on. So,
well, yeah, I mean, I was very,
saying.
Maybe it was a women thing, because I know a lot of the women who write about this. I know Melissa Murray and Leah Littman and I were all, we're all kind of like, this is not good and this is what happened. And then there were people who were mostly men, ironically, who were all like, no, this is great. And I think the time since, and we can talk about that in Q&A too, has sort of suggested that the people who were negative about it were right. The sense that local courts have been interpreting what Robert Stein did rather as a kind of green light to uphold more abortion restrictions. So
totally. And I do want to, there's a follow-up question that I really love that I wanted to ask. So how damaging would a ruling be that invalidates the third-party standing of abortion providers?
It would be a really big deal. I mean, the third-party standing strategy.
Well, let's explain what third-party standing is. Yeah.
Yeah, so whenever you want to challenge the constitutionality of a law, like either you as the rights holder can do it, right? So if you're a pregnant person and you can't have an abortion, you could bring a lawsuit. Or sometimes someone who's close enough to you can bring a challenge on your behalf, and that's called third-party standing. And there are usually limits on when that can happen. There has to be a close enough relationship between the third party and you, and there has to be some reason you couldn't vindicate your own rights. And since the 70s, the Supreme Court has said that abortion providers and clinics can bring challenges on behalf of pregnant people. And the reasons were sort of twofold. One, it's hard for pregnant people to bring their own lawsuits, whether that's because pregnancy doesn't last indefinitely, or because pregnant people are pregnant and that can kind of suck and they don't necessarily want to also spend all their time litigating, or because in a lot of communities, particularly in the Midwest and the South, there may be, safety consequences or privacy consequences that make people, even if they're allowed to use pseudonyms, make people afraid of exposure. And then there's always been the thought that, abortion providers as doctors have, fiduciary duty to care about their patients, so their interests are aligned. And so this summer, you saw the beginning of an effort, I don't think it's over yet, but the beginning of an effort to say that abortion clinics and doctors shouldn't be able to sue anymore. And a lot of major anti-abortion groups have been behind this effort, and they've essentially argued that's because one of the major strategies going back to the 90s, that's because abortion hurts women and pregnant people. And so asking abortion providers to look out for pregnant people is like asking the fox to guard the hen house, right? There's a conflict of interest. And so the reason that would have been a big deal and still could be a big deal is, one, because the vast majority of constitutional lawsuits are brought by abortion providers and clinics. Like if you just Google abortion cases, you'll see that all of the names are like Planned Parenthood versus Casey, and it's always a clinic or a doctor. It's almost never a patient. So it would introduce a lot of new hurdles to litigating abortion cases. And then I think symbolically, it's part of this reversal strategy, right? Which has been to say, and it's been part of this sort of disinformation idea that Becca and I were talking about earlier, the idea that there is no trade-off between equality and autonomy for people who are seeking abortions and fetal rights, because it turns out abortion has been bad for everybody all along. That's an argument that the anti-abortion movement's been relying on pretty heavily. And if the Supreme Court bought that argument in the context standing, there's no reason to believe they wouldn't buy that argument when it comes to the overturning of Roe. So it would also be important in what it signals about where we might be going in terms of not only whether Roe would be overturned, but on what basis.
Kathy Asmus also has a question. She says, how has pro-choice organizing coalition building changed over the course of the pandemic? Are there any silver linings?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's been hard to do kind of classic grassroots organizing, especially for people who believe that COVID is real, because COVID makes it harder to do things like have large gatherings or go door to door. I think there have been silver linings in the sense that there has been momentum, both, I think, in the grassroots community and also in the medical community, and mobilizing doctors to actually support a lot of grassroots organizing. Like you begin to see, for example, the American Medical Association joining some coalition building for the first time really in a long time. I think that's promising, especially when you're dealing with, disputed facts. It's really important to have, leading medical organizations backing you up. I think there's also been, not just the pandemic, but I think probably the Black Lives Matter movement and the new focus on racial justice has, I think, continued to put pressure on the larger reproductive rights organizations to make racial justice concerns a central part of organizing, which I really think is going to have to be, it's going to have to happen for the reproductive rights movement to be effective, just because if you think about who's the most affected by existing abortion restrictions, who's going to be the most affected if abortion is made a crime, it's always going to be people of color. So if the reproductive rights movement isn't led in part by people of color or listening to people of color, that's historically not ended well. I would expect it to continue to not end well. So I think the kind of the pandemic's shining a light on health disparities for people of color, combined with the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movements, kind of reckoning, I think, has put ongoing pressure on the movement and the coalition to keep talking about racial justice in productive ways.
Great. Colleen wants to know why the United States has such lousy and short paid maternity leave policies, to which my answer, of course, would be Republicans and patriarchal power structures. But what's yours?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of that. I think it's a combination of Republicans and Phyllis Schlafly was a big part of this, right? The idea that
absolutely.
The option to have paid maternity leave was somehow an assault on traditional homemakers who didn't want to work. And I think that framing has been with us for a while. But I think some of it, I mean, it's the Republican Party to be sure, but it's also just sort of American culture. It's really hard even to get, and I think that's one of the, if you want to sort of have a look in the mirror moment, if you study the history of this, it's the reproductive rights movement hasn't always cared about things like paid maternity leave or access to abortion for low-income people as much as it should either, right? I mean, there's this sort of fetishization sometimes of freedom at the expense of, actually being able to access stuff. We have unpaid leave, right? Which people probably thought was enough, which of course for anyone who's ever been asked to take unpaid leave is not enough, right? Most people like to get paid. So, but I think that it's probably sort of part of our constitutional and general culture, combined with, the GOP taking that position. And the fact that there was really a concentrated movement against paid maternity leave for decades among social conservatives.
I think that's such a powerful part of the reproductive justice movement, that they approach reproductive autonomy with this holistic idea of, women not only should be able to have access to abortion care, they should have access to good maternity care and paid maternity leave. So it was also just thinking about that. So we have a question about what arguments might work or not work against, the right of women to have choice. So she says, for example, is talking about how women will still get abortions dangerous? Should the issues of rape be separated, or would it work against choice? What about the issue of giving more money for more children? I think what this person is getting at is the strategy behind how we talk about choice.
I think I get it. Yeah, I mean, especially to people who don't agree. In my experience, it's almost a self-defeating question in the sense that I don't think if you have a talking point, it almost by definition doesn't work because it feels like a talking point. So when I've heard people who don't agree on this, or people who are opposed to abortion kind of get it, is if you talk about it from you as a human being, person to person, right? So this is why I feel the way I do. And this is the experience, these are the experiences I've had that brought me to this belief. Because people occasionally then can sort of get out of you're just talking as a liberal or a pro-choice person, and they can see you talking to them as a human being. And occasionally too, when you do that, you'll find that people who are opposed to abortion have weird kind of conflicted views, right? Where they maybe are opposed to abortion, but not all the time, or not for all people, or whatever. And I find those kinds of conversations tend to be more productive. I mean, if you're talking about political strategy, right? Like sort of what do you focus on? That's a very different question. But if you're actually trying to sort of have a productive conversation with someone who you're pretty sure isn't going to agree with you on abortion, I think you're better off approaching it. And I think that the converse is true too. I mean, the most sort of humanizing experiences and the sort of least depressing part of studying this is that I've talked to lots of people who don't agree with me about abortion, who have been quite nice to me about other things and have sort of walked me through how they got where they were. And even though I don't come out at the same place as them a lot of the times, I can understand how they got there. And then when I have empathy for them as individuals, I'm not going to just dismiss everything they say as crazy. And I think that goes the other way too. So if you're pro-choice and you want people to respect and hear you, it's better to be a little bit more like speak as an individual. I think it's more productive.
Yeah, absolutely. Stacy Crota wants to know, given the current makeup of the Supreme Court, what do you think of calls for Justice Breyer to retire now while the Democrats control the Senate? This makes me think of the night that the Georgia elections were being called. There was this GIF going around of the genie from Aladdin when the cuffs sort of come off and he's free. This is Stephen Breyer right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think, obviously there's more of a focus on that, in part because of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's passing, right? Because she didn't retire during the Obama administration, and that, of course, opened the door to a 6-3 majority. Now, justices don't always care about that because there was huge pressure on Justices Alito and Thomas to retire in the waning days of the Trump administration. It's really funny because all these people would sort of air like, hey, I heard this rumor that Justice Alito is retiring, which was totally not true. It was just like wish fulfillment. So it's not clear. I mean, at the end of the day, Justice Breyer is, an autonomous individual who's going to do what he wants. But I think he will at least be aware of the fact that, if he doesn't retire in the first 2 years of the Biden administration, he's rolling the dice that he'll be replaced by, the next President Trump. And I think Biden, one of the things people have speculated about with his choice of Merrick Garland as Attorney General is that was designed in part to open a seat on the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, which is often the sort of considered the most prestigious of the circuit courts. And that whoever would be put there for maybe like 6 months to a year, and then would ultimately be elevated to replace Justice Breyer. So the Biden administration is certainly sort of shuffling things around with an expectation that that's going to happen. But the Supreme Court justices, sometimes have a tendency of doing what they want. I mean, lifetime appointments can do that to you.
Do we have any other questions?
I think that was it.
Right.
Thank you. This has been a wonderful conversation. Becca, thank you. And Mary, thank you so much for both your time and your knowledge for sharing it with us tonight. This has been very informative. And thank you both. And thank you all who've been watching. Thanks for tuning in. Please get a copy of the book if you don't have one, and get a copy for your friends. And more importantly, make sure that you're talking about these things with the people around you. I think that's it. I hope you guys all take care and stay well. And eventually, hopefully, we can meet in person again. But until then, hope to see you here on the internet.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks everybody. We appreciate your coming.
Thank you all. Have a great night tonight. Take care.
Night, y'all.